Chapter 6 to 10. Chapter 6. I hardly saw Osbert that week because he went to school, unlike Isaac and Emmett and Piper, who were supposed to be homeschooled, which, as far as I could tell, meant reading whatever books you happened to be interested in, and every once in a blue moon having Aunt Pen say, "Have you learned any geography?" and them saying yes. Now, this was clearly one of the greatest improvements on the education system since time began, and I was greatly looking forward to being enrolled. But Aunt Pen said that I didn't have to do much of anything until autumn term, which didn't start until September. And by that time, no one was going to school anyway, due to you know what. Without anyone making a big deal out of it or punching me on the shoulder and saying, "You're okay, Cousin Daisy," like they do on TV, Piper and Emmond and Isaac and I started doing pretty much everything together. Though sometimes I forgot to count Isaac because he could go days without saying a single word. I knew Aunt Pen wasn't worried about him because I heard her say to someone that he'd speak when he was ready to speak. But all I could think of was that in New York, a kid like that would have been stuck in a straitjacket practically from birth and dangled over a tank full of educational consultants and remedial experts, all snapping at his ankles for the next 20 years, arguing about his special needs and getting paid plenty for it. I went quietly down to Aunt Pen's office a few nights later, hoping I might be able to send some emails to all the people who must have thought I disappeared off the face of the earth. And there was a light on under the door and Aunt Pen's voice saying, "Edmund?" I thought at first I'd say nothing, just sneak away, but at the last minute I changed my mind and said, "No, it's Daisy." And Aunt Pen said, "Oh, Daisy, please come in." And she looked so happy to see me and said, "Sit by the fire a minute." Even though it was April, it was freezing cold at night, and she said, "You wouldn't believe what it costs to heat this drafty old house." I huddled up close to the fire and she put her work away, saying she'd done more than enough for one night. And when she saw I was still shivering, she got up from her chair and wrapped a blanket around me, all the time with a look on her face like a smile, only sadder. And then she sat down next to me on the sofa and started telling me about her sister. And it took me only a second to realize the person she meant was my mother. She told me things I never knew, like how her sister was all set to go to university to study history when she fell in love with my father and decided not to go after all, which made their father furious. And when she went away to live in America, hardly any of the family was speaking to her. Then, from the top of her desk, Aunt Pen took down a framed picture of two young women looking almost the same, one of them laughing and one looking serious, and holding on to the neck of a huge, wild looking gray dog Aunt Pen said was called Lady. As a joke, because she had no manners at all. But look how your mother adored her. I've seen plenty of pictures of my mother at home, but almost always with my father, and not a single one taken before he knew her. So this was strange because she looked so different. Happy and young, like someone you've known in another life. Aunt Pen said I could keep the photograph, but I said no thank you because it seemed to belong to that desk in that room, and I didn't want to drag it away to a foreign place. Aunt Pen rubbed one hand across her eyes and said it was late and we both needed to go to bed. But just as I was getting to the door, she said, "When your mother phoned me to tell me she was pregnant, she sounded happier than she'd ever sounded in her whole life about that baby," which was you, Daisy. Then she told me to run upstairs before I caught cold, but it seemed like hours before I stopped shivering. The next day, Aunt Pen set off to Oslo, and we didn't think much about it except that we were in charge and pretty happy about it. But later, when you look back on the whole story, you realize at the moment she left was exactly the moment we all started skewing off into crisis, like how Archduke Ferdinand getting killed started World War I, even though the connection, to me at least, was never that clear. At the time, she just kissed each of us and smiled and told us to be sensible, and there was something about the way she didn't even miss a beat when it came to kissing me that made me feel better than almost all the nice things that had happened since I'd arrived. We didn't get much of a chance to sit back and enjoy being orphans before things started happening. The first thing that happened wasn't our fault. That was a bomb that went off in the middle of a big train station in London on the day after Aunt Pen went to Oslo, and something like 7 or 70,000 people got killed. This obviously went over very badly with the populace at large and was pretty scary. But to be honest, it didn't seem to have much to do with us, way off in the country. How did it affect us? How it did affect us made them close all the airports, which meant no one could get home for the foreseeable future, namely Aunt Pen. None of us dared to say that having no parents at all was pretty cool, but you didn't have to be a mind reader to figure it out. Basically, we couldn't believe our luck, and for a little while it felt like we were on some big train rolling down a hill, and what we cared about was how great it felt to be going fast. That same day after the first bomb went off, everyone just sat glued to the television and the radio, and the telephone kept ringing, asking us if we were okay. But given we were about 40 million miles from the epicenter, I'd say we stood a pretty good chance of surviving. Of course, everyone was talking about food shortages and shutting down transportation and calling up all the able bodied men and basically all the gloom and doom stuff they could possibly think of in the limited time allotted. And the guys on the radio were talking in solemn voices, asking anyone they could drag off the street whether this meant war. And then we had to listen to all the solemn experts pretending to have the inside track when any one of them would have given his left arm to know the game plan himself. Eventually, my father got through from the office, and I guess I heard my voice. And I guess hearing my voice convinced him I was still alive and there was nothing to worry about because afterwards we had our usual conversation, him saying, "How are you? Do you need any money or want to come home?" And me just answering, "Yes, yes, no, no, whatever." He said they were all worried about me, but I couldn't think who they might be. And then he said he had a meeting, so he had to go, but he loved me. And when I didn't say anything, he hung up. Well, I couldn't take much more of all the blah, 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 so Edmund and I walked down the long hill to the village, which was extremely picturesque and full of little houses all connected up and made of the same yellowy stone as our house. It wasn't very big, but there were lots of little roads with identical houses except for different knickknacks in the windows spreading out on either side of the main street. And Edmund said it was big enough to have a weekly market, 3 bakeries, 2 butchers, a church, originally from the 12th century, a tea shop, 2 pubs, one good, one bad one with a hotel, and a number of lifelong drunks, at least one suspected child molester, a shoe store that only sold raincoats and waterproof boots, and footballs and penny candy and Tweety Bird backpacks. There was one building near the center that was a little bigger and square than all the rest, and that was the town hall. And across from it was a cobbled square where the market appeared every Wednesday, and in one corner diagonally opposite was one of the pubs. It was named the Salmon because of the fishmonger next door, but when the fishmonger shut down, no one bothered to change the name. In the other corner was a ye old English version of a 7-Eleven, which for some reason was also a post office and a drugstore and sold newspapers out front if all else failed. We went in, and with the money Aunt Pen left for the weekend, bought as much bottled water and canned things as we could carry home, which was a lot more fun than staring at the same old picture of smoking carnage on TV. And we tried to be very mature about the kind of food we might need in a siege, and which, let's face it, wasn't the most likely scenario for the back of beyond. We weren't the only ones at the shop, but people were still fairly friendly, especially to 2 kids on their own, and no one tried to kick us to the ground or steal our pear halves. That still left a whole afternoon with the end of the world about to happen, so we walked back up the hill to the house, more slowly this time because of all the bottled water. And when we got there, Emmett decided we should move up and camp on the lambing barn because it was over a mile away from the house and so well hidden behind a group of oak trees that no one would find it if they didn't know what they were looking for. We figured if the enemy was going to come all the way down here, we'd better think of a way to make ourselves totally invisible. Though, in fact, the main reason was that it was something to do. So Piper and Isaac and Emmett and I started dragging provisions and blankets and books up to the lambing barn, which was usually just used to store hay, and except for the mice, it was comfortable and dry and had water for when it was used for lambing. So we told Osbert we were staying up there for the foreseeable future, but he barely seemed to notice because he was busy watching nothing happening on the news and calling his friends and looking worried, trying to figure out, along with 60 million other people, whether we are in a war or not. Anyways, it was around mid-afternoon that we settled in, and Piper brought Osborne's Boy Scout survival guide and decided we had to collect and cook all our own food. So she hiked all the way back to the house, gathered some blue eggs, and dug some early potatoes from the next field over, and threatened to dry worms on a stone and grind them into powder to add protein in stews. Since none of us was short on protein except me and I was used to it, we managed to convince her to save the worm powder for a rainy day, and she looked a little crestfallen but didn't press the point. While she was foraging for food, Isaac arrived from the house with a big straw bag full of cheese and ham and a fruitcake in a tin, and dried apricots and a big bottle of apple juice and a thick slab of plain chocolate wrapped in brown paper. We hid the bag in a feed box so we wouldn't hurt Piper's feelings, and what she served in the end wasn't exactly a meal fit for a king, but it had the right feel for an emergency. Edmund and Isaac made a fire and baked the potatoes right in it, and then when it died down, Piper put the eggs in the coals on the side, and though some turned out sort of raw on the inside, that wasn't toward the fire, they apparently tasted okay. I told them I was too excited to eat anything, and that seemed fine with everyone except Edmund, who looked at me in his way as usual, and I noticed that once you realize someone's watching you, it's pretty hard not to find yourself watching them back. Afterwards, we made up a big bed in the hayloft by putting blankets down. We took our shoes off and got in together, still in our clothes, First Isaac, then Emmond, then me, then Piper, in that order. And though we kept a decent distance at first, eventually we all gave up and moved together because of the bats flying all around, and the sound of the crickets or the frogs, which can be quite lonely, and the cold night, and the thought of all those dead people a million miles away in London. I wasn't used to sleeping that close to anyone else, and as much as I liked having Piper always holding onto my hand, it kind of restricted how much I could turn over, and I'm pretty sure I was the last one to fall asleep. I could hear Jet and Jin below us in the barn, and a long time after I thought he was asleep, Edmund said in a quiet voice that the dogs always stayed up here during the lambing, because that's when they were needed most for the rounding up the sheep, and we were probably confusing them by being here now. And the soft sound of his voice made me want to move closer to him than I did, a little. And for a while we just looked at each other without blinking or saying a word. Then he moved his head to the right just enough so he could brush his cheek against the part of my arm that was near his face. And after that, he closed his eyes and fell asleep while I lay there and wondered if that's the feeling you're supposed to have when your cousin touches a totally innocent part of your anatomy that's even fully clothed. I lay there for a while more, smelling the smell of tobacco in Emmond's hair and waiting to fall asleep, and I remember thinking about a painting we had to copy in art class, once called The Calm Before the Storm. It showed an old-fashioned sailing ship on a dead flat sea, and the sky behind it was all sorts of golden orange and red colors, and it looked like the picture of peace if you hadn't noticed the greenish-black section up on one corner, which was obviously the storm. And for some reason, I used to think about that painting a lot, I guess because of the feeling you get when you know that something awful is going to happen, and no one in the painting does. And if you could only get and warn them, then the rest of their lives might be different. The calm before the storm seemed like the right sort of phrase to jump into a person's mind on this occasion, no matter how happy I was, just at that moment, because given how my life had gone so far, I'd had lots of practice in not expecting everything to turn out like your basic Hollywood tearjerker, with the blind girl, played by this year's Oscar hopeful, and the crippled boy miraculously walking and everyone going home happy. Chapter 7. The next day, without actually saying that we were abandoning our plan to live in the barn, we kind of gravitated back towards the house to have a bath and get clean clothes. Because if you want to know the truth about how romantic it is to sleep in a barn, it isn't very, due to the hay itching and the bats and how cold it gets at night, even though it's supposed to be spring. Back at the house, Osbert was annoyed because he'd had to milk the goats by himself and it was Piper's job, and it turned out that Aunt Pen had called from Oslo and told him she was doing everything in her power to get home, and in the meantime there was some money in the bank account to tide us over, and she'd already spoken to the bank manager about us getting it. Osbert said she sounded more worried about the world than about us, but he didn't seem annoyed at being second best, and Piper said it's because she knows we'll be fine. For a second, while Osbert was talking about Aunt Pen, Edmund's face looked very pale, but he was facing Isaac, so I couldn't be absolutely sure. When he turned around again, he was fairly normal, and said, "There are people all over the world who will help her if they can." And that was the end of the conversation. The good old Royal Mill didn't seem to have any clue that there was going to be a war starting up, and that day there was a letter from my dad and one from Leah. Dad yammered on a lot about Davina the D and how she was feeling with the pregnancy and all, like it was preying on my mind, that she might be feeling uncomfortable, when in fact I just hoped her ankles would swell up like balloons, and her breasts would sag down to her knees, and the silicone in them would turn to cement. There was a little something stuck at the end of the letter about missing me, and how I should be careful not to become a victim of the terrorist threat, and had I managed to gain any weight, blah blah blah. Leah's letter was much more entertaining, with reports of Miss Cool herself, Melissa Banner, was going around telling everyone that she and Lyle Hirschberg were hooking up. Well, if this Banner headline is true, I swear to God I will assign all my worldly goods to the Salvation Army, and I'd say there's no danger of some religious tuba player ending up with my DVD player, given that Lyle is famous for telling his last girlfriend, Mimi Maloney, that if she didn't satisfy his needs at least 3 times a day, he'd have to find relief elsewhere. And Melissa Banner is the world's most famous living professional version. Leah walked in on once Lyle satisfying his needs all by himself in home room when everyone should have been at this school assembly, and she said, "Well, well, well, Lyle Hirschberg, don't look now, but there's a smurf with a heart on in your pants." Or at least she claims that's what she said. But not to be disloyal or anything, I've always had my doubts. I wanted to talk all this through with Leah right then and there, and I nearly cried with how much I missed having a cell phone that worked and email, even though I did have 112 wacky cousins instead. So I sat down and wrote back all about Emmett and Piper and Isaac and the animals in the house and the war, and I made it sound even better than it actually was. And by the time I finished the letter, I'd convinced myself that this was the life. Oh, yes. And boy, had I lucked out. But it's easier said than done to convince yourself that God has smiled on you when the actual fact is you're living with strangers due to the evil workings of your wicked stepmother, not to mention your official next of kin. Then in came Osbert again with a face like a dead pigeon and said there were more attacks, this time on the USA. And when, to seem interested, I said, "How terrible? Where?" He said, "Pittsburgh and Detroit and Houston," only he pronounced it Houston. Well, part of me was happy they hadn't bombed the Upper West Side, and part of me started having this pretty good fantasy about Dad and Davina all bandaged up and limping and trying to come here to live with us, and us saying, "Oh, we're so sorry. The airports are shut. Otherwise, we'd simply love to have you. Really, we would." I tried eating a little bit of bacon today because Edmund particularly asked me, but it tasted like pig and I gagged. Chapter 8. I'm thinking now would be a good time to talk to Isaac because he's the one who gets left out most of the action due to hardly ever saying a word. But I'm starting to realize it's the ones who aren't yakking all the time who sometimes turn out to be the ones worth keeping an eye on. At first I barely noticed him, what with nosing Edmund so much and Piper holding my hand all the time and chickens clucking and dogs barking and sheep baaing and not to mention half the world blowing up and the pipes banging night and day. So it took me longer than usual to get the picture that while Piper and Edmund were busy watching over me, Isaac was busy watching over them. He didn't do it in an obvious way like Osbert, who was always pushing himself into the conversation with superior information and making it clear that he was the one with family responsibilities, which frankly exhausted him, and he'd rather not be bothered only seeing as how he was the eldest. Well, deep sigh. Edmund, on the other hand, was totally upfront, even if he did surprise you in about 500,000 ways each day. When Edmund was listening into your thoughts, you could tell by looking at him looking at you. Isaac was more shadowy and kept his counsel, as my doorman used to say about anyone who didn't like to gossip. This doesn't mean there was anything sneaky about his way of watching, or anything sentimental either. He just accepted the things people did, without comment or judgment, and maybe without being terribly concerned. Even his family seemed to interest him in an abstract way, like lab specimens he'd come to feel responsibility and affection for. At times, I thought he was more animal than human. For instance, if you were walking in town on market day and there were tons of people milling around, you would never have to worry about losing him in a crowd, even if you totally forgot he was there and got separated for ages. You can zig and zag and make turns on a sudden whim and stop for tea and cut across a few back streets and decide that today would be a good time to do something totally different and try that bakery that none of you normally went to, when in actual fact you had plenty of bread already at home, so there'd be no reason to be in a bakery at all. And the next time you look at it, Isaac would be right at your elbow, totally casual, like he'd been there all along or possibly just followed your train of thought through a crowd. It was like he understood humans objectively, and it could see your entire life stretching out in both directions, including whether you were going to make a detour to the bakery and which one and when. With non humans, he was completely different. With a dog or horse or badger or fox, every fiber of his being was totally engaged. Even his face was different around animals, with the expression of polite distance he always wore for humans, replaced by something concentrated and alive. They knew it too. You could search hours for a pregnant cat, and Isaac would tell you to look under the hedge, felt in the garden shed, and there she'd be with 5 kittens, probably already having told him what each one was named. Piper said people used to borrow him when they went to buy a new dog because he could see if something wasn't quite right just by looking, or if it was the type to savage your new baby to death on a whim. You might wonder, as I did, what a dog or sheep had to say to a person like Isaac that's so interesting, but I guess he might have said the same thing about a foreign life form like me. What have I ever said that's so riveting to anyone but myself? Shrinks don't count. They listen for cash. Chapter 9. Today there was a knock on the door, and it turned out to be 2 bored-looking men from the council coming to register us and determine our medical and nutritional emergencies. Nutritional exigencies, which turned out to mean did any of us have appendicitis or scurvy. They had a list about as thick as a phone book with names and addresses, and some were checked off and some crossed out, and there were hundreds of question marks scattered around the pages, and boy, did you ever get a sense that they wished they'd asked a few more questions before signing up for this job. After finding a pen on the list and putting a bunch of X's and question marks by our name, and asking a few official type questions, they asked to speak to our guardian, and seemed fairly taken aback to discover that the closest thing we had to a grown-up on the premises was Osborne. But seeing as how there wasn't much they could do about our situation, short of filing an official complaint that no one would ever notice or read or care about, they decided to stick to the questions they'd asked everyone else for miles round, like, were there any animals on the farm kept for food? Osbert said the sheep were very rare and kept for breeding and wool, and that for selling, and so on, to other farms. And goats for pets. But the hens were all layers, which struck me as funny because after that, all I could think of was layers and layers of hens. Then they asked for everyone's names and ages, and Osbert said I was their American cousin, and they looked even more confused and wanted to see my passport, and then asked lots of questions about Dad and what was he doing, sending his only daughter away from home at a time like this, and I said, well, don't think that question hasn't occurred to me too. Then they both looked at me with the evil eye I seem to get from just about everyone else these days and asked if we had enough money for food. And Osbert explained we had some money from his mother's account, and the men said, we'll do what we can for you, and added that it wasn't definite, but rationing would probably start any day now due to the embargoes, and school was closing early for summer holidays, and we should stay off the roads. Like hanging around on the roads was the world's best entertainment. We asked them what was going to happen next, how long they thought the war would last, but by the totally blank looks they gave us in return, you got the sense none of these questions had occurred to them before. Well, it was reassuring to know the local government was taking an interest, but their visit didn't exactly cause any radical changes to our lifestyle, since for the last few days we'd mostly been hanging around, wondering what to do next, broken up by trips to town where we had to wait in line for hours listening to people's gossip about what was really going on. The short answer, if you ask me, was that nobody had the slightest clue, but it sure didn't stop them from pretending that we did. People who had friends, or friends of friends, who had managed to get phone calls or emails through, said that London was occupied and there were tanks and soldiers in the streets and fire and anarchy all around. Supposedly, the hospitals were filled to bursting with all the people who'd been poisoned or bombed, and everyone was fighting over food and drinkable water. One crazy old man kept whispering to anyone who would listen that the BBC had been taken over by malign forces and that we shouldn't believe anything we heard on the wireless. But his wife rolled her eyes and said he was still worried about the Germans from last time around. Everyone tried to look like they knew all about the news already, or that they had much more recent information, but weren't at liberty to give it away. I saw expressions on people's faces that I'd never seen before, something like anxiety and superiority and paranoia all mixed up in one polite grimace. Each day we'd walk down the hill to the village and hang around in a line outside the village shop, waiting for our turn to get inside and choose a few sectionals. For some reason, it reminded me of the supermarket sweep, which I'd always wanted to go on, only there wasn't much in the way of food, and you weren't allowed to run around stuffing as much as possible into bags. The worst part was having to listen to everybody's crackpot theories, and there was no hope you could pretend to be deaf due to being such a small town and everybody knowing everything about you. Here's the sort of thing we'd hear, all in low, hushed tones, especially when us children were around. And if it doesn't sound so bad to you, try playing it on an endless loop while you listen and smile politely until your cheeks go into spasm and you develop a twitch. 1. My brother in law says it's the French bastards. 2. My friend in Chelsea says the looting is terrible and she got the most amazing widescreen TV. 3. My neighbor in the Lord said it's the Chinese. 4. Have you ever noticed there are no Jews have been killed? 5. There's a nuclear bunker under Marks and Spencer that's only open to shareholders. 6. People are eating their pets. 7. The Queen is bearing up. 8. The Queen is breaking down. 9. The Queen is one of them. You can imagine it was the social event of the day, everyone competing for the worst piece of news. One of the couples who lived in London but had weekend house near the village were here for the duration, saying they had 2 kids and a purebred Bouvier de Flandre, which turns out to be a dog, and they figured it would be a whole lot safer here than in London. Well, they're probably right about being safer if you didn't count the locals who were suddenly getting all of them and us all over the place. So far, it was fairly civilized, but you could see that under the surface, everyone hated those people and their fancy French sounding dog, and were just waiting for a chance to get even when the food ran out. A lot of worried families asked if we needed a place to stay because of Aunt Pen being gone, but it was obvious they didn't really want us, even if we wanted them, which we didn't. Sometimes when we said no thank you, they looked so relieved we couldn't help feeling a little hurt. As every day passed, you could see the panic on more and more people's faces, and the rest carefully composed their features to look somber and made clucking noises and said how awful it was. But once we were away from them, we actually felt pretty cheerful and laughed on the walk back to the house, partly to cheer Piper up and partly because it still felt like an adventure and because the sun was shining and it was a beautiful walk, war or no war. I was desperate to tell Leah about all this stuff and how totally great it was to have no grown-ups around telling you what to do all the time. Not that I went around saying that out loud, but let's face it. No matter how much you put on a sad expression and talked about how awful it was that all those people were killed and what about democracy and the future of our great nation, the fact that none of us kids had said out loud was we didn't really care. Most of the people who got killed were either old like our parents, so they had good lives already, or people who worked in banks and were pretty boring anyway, or the people we didn't know. Osbert and his friends from school said they thought it would be amazing to live in London and be spies and duck around the enemy, trying to get information, and I thought, right, Osbert and a bunch of his snotty schoolboy friends would be the first people I'd fall back on to save the nation if I happened to be a prime minister. Later that day, I found Edmund in the lower barn feeding the animals, and I played with Ding while he milked the goats. Ding was as nice as a puppy and would just butt you politely with his head until you rubbed his ears, and then he'd stand there in a kind of trance with his eyes closed, leaning on you more and more the more you rubbed him. And if you stepped away, he'd fall over. After a while, we took the milk back to the house and started to rain, and Edmund and I went back and sat in my room, and he smoked, and we talked about lots of things. And he asked me all sorts of questions that usually drive me insane, like, why didn't I eat much? For some reason, I didn't get mad at him for asking, and I really tried to explain about at first not wanting to get poisoned by my stepmother and how much it annoyed her. And after a while, I discovered I liked the feeling of being hungry and the fact that it drove everyone stark raving mad and cost my father a fortune in shrinks. And also, it was something I was good at. He didn't look at me while I was talking, but after a few minutes, he lay back and let his knee rest against my knee. And I got another one of those feelings you're not supposed to get from your cousin, and I wondered very quietly to myself what was happening here. But of course, it doesn't matter how quietly you wonder things when Edmund is listening. It takes a whole lot of practice to get used to being careful about what you think in the privacy of your own brain. On the other hand, there are advantages in being able to think something that you can count on being overheard. It eliminates a lot of fumbling around. Do you ever think about dying? Edmund asked me, talking on a tangent. And I said yes, all the time, but mostly as a way of making other people feel guilty. And he didn't say anything, but when a lot later I went over the conversation in my head, I realized I'd never asked him the same question back. We were very quiet for the longest time, just listening to the rain on the window, with his leg resting against mine, and feeling flying between us in this crazy, jagged way, like a bird caught in a broom. The feeling, which had been starting up for a while now, was so strong it made me dizzy. And so far, we'd just been pretending it was what cousinly love felt like, and all that garbage you tell yourself when you want to pretend something's not really happening. After some more time, I tried an experiment by thinking something very, very quietly to myself, and then nothing happened for ages. Edmund just lay there with his eyes closed, and I felt a little disappointed and a little relieved all at the same time. And then, just as I was moving on the other things on my head, he propped himself up on one elbow and looked at me with a little half smile, and then kissed me on the mouth, so gently and sweetly. And then we kissed again, only not quite so sweetly. And after a little while of this, my brain and my body and every single inch of me that was alive was flooded with the feeling that I was starving, starving, starving for Edmund. And what a coincidence! That was the feeling I loved best in the world.